The Life of Abraham Lincoln. Chapter 4. Indiana. The death of his wife left Thomas Lincoln with the care of 3 young children, namely Sarah, about 11 years old, Abe, 10 years old, and the foster brother Dennis, a year or 2 younger. The father was not able to do woman's work as well as his wife had been able to do man's work, and the condition of the home was pitiable indeed. To the 3 motherless children and the bereaved father it was a long and dreary winter. When spring came they had the benefits of life in the woods and fields, and so lived through the seasons until the end of the following winter. It is not to be wondered at that the father was unwilling to repeat the loneliness of the preceding year. Early in December 1819 he returned to Elizabethtown and proposed marriage to a widow, Mrs. Sally Bush Johnston. The proposal must have been direct, with few preliminaries or none, for the couple were married next morning. The new wife brought him a fortune. In addition to 3 children of various ages, of sundry articles of household furniture. Parents, children, and goods were shortly after loaded into a wagon drawn by a 4-horse team, and in all the style of this frontier, 4 in hand, were driven over indescribable roads through woods and fields to their Indiana home. The accession of Sally Bush's furniture made an important improvement in the home. What was more important, she had her husband finish the log cabin by providing window, door, and floor. What was most important of all, she brought the sweet spirit of an almost ideal motherhood into the home, giving to all the children alike a generous portion of mother love. The children now numbered 6, and not only were they company for one another, but the craving for womanly affection, which is the most persistent hunger in the heart of child or man, was beautifully met. She did not humor them to the point of idleness, strictness without imperiousness. She kept them from bad habits and retained their affection to the last. The influence upon the growing lad of 2 such women as Nancy Hanks and Sally Bush was worth more than that of the best appointed college in all the land. The boy grew into youth, and he grew very fast. While still in his teens, he reached the full stature of his manhood, 6 feet and 4 inches. His strength was astonishing, and many stories were told of this and subsequent periods to illustrate his physical prowess, such as, he once lifted up a hen coop weighing 600 pounds and carried it off bodily. He could lift a full barrel of cider to his mouth and drink from the bunghole. He could sink an axe half deeper into a log than any man in the country. During the period of growth into youth he spent much of his time in reading, talking, and after a fashion making speeches. His political writings won great admiration from his neighbors. He occasionally wrote satires which, while not refined, were very stinging. This would not be worth mentioning were it not for the fact that it shows that from boyhood he knew the force of this formidable weapon, which later he used with so much skill. The country store furnished the frontier substitute for the club, and there the men were wont to congregate. It is needless to say that young Lincoln was the life of the gatherings, being the expert of the telling of a humorous story and having always a plenty supply. His speech-making proved so attractive that his father was forced to forbid him to practice it during work hours because the men would always leave their work to listen to him. During these years he had no regular employment, but did odd jobs wherever he got the chance. At one time, for example, on a ferry boat for the munificent wages of 37½ cents a day. When 16 years old, Lincoln had his first lesson in oratory. He attended Court Boonville, county seat of Warwick County, and heard a case in which one of the aristocratic Breckinridges of Kentucky was attorney for the defense. The power of his oratory was a revelation to the lad. At its conclusion, the awkward, ill-dressed, bashful but enthusiastic young Lincoln pressed forward to offer his congratulations and thanks to the eloquent lawyer, who laughingly brushed by him without accepting the proffered hand. In later years the men met again, this time in Washington City, in the White House. The president reminded Breckinridge of the incident which he latter had no desire to recall. When about 19 years old, he made his first voyage down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. Two incidents are worth recording of this trip. The purpose was to find, in New Orleans, a market for produce, which was simply floated downstream on a flatboat. There was, of course, a rowboat for tender. The crew consisted of himself and a young gentry, son of his employer. Near Baton Rouge, they had tied up for the night in accordance with the custom of flatboat navigation. During the night they were awakened by a gang of 7 ruffian Negroes who had come aboard to loot the stuff. Lincoln shouted, "Who's there?" Receiving no reply, he seized a handspike and knocked over the first, second, third, and fourth in turn. When the remaining 3 took to the woods, the Northerners pursued them a short distance, then returned, loosed their craft, and floated safely to their destination. It was on this trip that Lincoln earned his first dollar, and he in after years related to William H. Seward. A steamer was going down the river. We have, no wharves on the western streams, and the custom was, if passengers were at any of the landings, they were to go out in a boat, the steamer stopping and taking them on board. 2 men with trunks came down to the shore in carriages, and looking at the different boats, singled out mine. He asked, "Who owns this?" I modestly answered, "I do." "Will you take us and our trunks out to the steamer?" "Certainly." The trunks were put in my boat, the passengers seated themselves on them, and I sculled them out to the steamer. They got on board, and I lifted the trunks and put them on the deck. The steamer was about to put on steam again, when I called out, "You have forgotten to pay me." Each of them took from his pocket a silver $half and threw it on the bottom of my boat. I could scarcely believe my eyes as I picked up the money. You may think it was a very little thing, and in these days it seems to me like a trifle, but it was a most important incident in my life. I could scarcely credit that I, a poor boy, had earned $1 in less than a day, that by honest work I had earned $1. I was a more hopeful and thoughtful boy from that day. The goods were sold profitably at New Orleans, and the return trip was made by steamboat. This was about 20 years after Fulton's first voyage from New York to Albany, which required 7 days. Steamboats had been put on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, but these craft were of primitive construction, awkward as to shape and slow as to speed. The frequency of boiler explosions was proverbial for many years. The lads, Gentry and Lincoln, returned home duly, and the employer was well satisfied with the results of the expedition. In 1830, the epidemic milk-sick reappeared in Indiana, and Thomas Lincoln had a pardonable desire to get out of the country. Illinois was at that time setting up rapidly, and there were glowing accounts of its desirableness. He sold out and started with his family and household goods to his new destination. The time of year was March, just when the frost is coming out of the ground so that the mud is apparently bottomless. The author will not attempt to describe it, for he has in boyhood seen it many times and knows it to be indescribable. It was Abe's duty to drive the 4 yoke of oxen, a task which must have strained even his patience. they settled in Macon County, near Decatur. There the son faithfully worked with his father until the family was fairly settled. Then he started out in life for himself, for he had now reached the age of 21. As he had passed through the periods of childhood and youth, he was on the threshold of manhood, and it is right and fitting to receive at this point the testimony of Sally Bush, his stepmother. Abe was a good boy, and I can say what scarcely one woman, a mother, can say in 1,000. Abe never gave me a cross word or look, and never refused, in fact or appearance, to do anything I requested him. I never gave him a cross word in all my life. He was a dutiful son to me always. I think he loved me truly. I had a son, John, who was raised with Abe. Both were good boys, but I must say, both being now dead, that Abe was the best boy I ever saw or expected to see. These words of praise redound to the honor of the speaker equally with that of her illustrious stepson. Lincoln came into the estate of manhood morally clean. He had formed no habits that would cause years of struggle to overcome. He had committed no deed that would bring the blush of shame to his cheek. He was free from vice and from crime. He was not profane. He had never tasted liquor. He was no brawler. He never gambled. He was honest and truthful. On the other hand, he had a genius for making friends. He was the center of every social circle. He was a good talker and a close reasoner. Without a doubt of the great responsibilities awaiting him, he had thus far fitted himself well by his faithfulness in such duties as fell to him. Chapter 5. Second Journey to New Orleans. The first winter in Illinois, 1830-31, was one of those epochal seasons which came to all communities. It is remembered by the oldest inhabitant to this day for the extraordinary amount of snow that fell. There is little doing in such a community during any winter, but in such a winter as that there were practically nothing doing. Lincoln always held himself ready to accept any opportunity for work, but there was no opening that winter. The only thing he accomplished was what he did every winter and every summer of his life. Mainly, he made many friends. When spring opened, Denton Offutt decided to send a cargo of merchandise down to New Orleans. Hearing that Lincoln, John Hanks, and John Johnston were likely boys, he employed them to take charge of the enterprise. Their pay was to be 50 cents a day and found, and if the enterprise proved successful, an additional sum of $20. Lincoln said that none of them had ever seen so much money at one time, and that they were glad to accept the offer. Two events occurred during this trip which are of sufficient interest to bear narration. The boat with its cargo had been set afloat in the Sangamon River in Springfield. All went well until, at New Salem, they came to a mill dam where, in spite of the fact that the water was high, owing to the spring floods, the boat stuck. Lincoln rolled up his trousers, 5 feet more or less up his long, lank legs, waded out to the boat, and got the bow over the dam. Then, without waiting to bail the water out, he bored a hole in the bottom and let it run out. He constructed a machine which lifted and pushed the boat over the obstruction, and thus their voyage was quickly resumed. Many years later, when he was a practicing lawyer, he whittled out a model of his invention and had it patented. The model may today be seen in the Patent Office of Washington. The patent brought him no fortune, but it is an interesting relic. This incident is of itself entirely unimportant. It is narrated here solely because it illustrates one trait of the man, his ingenuity. He had remarkable fertility in devising ways and means of getting out of unexpected difficulties. When, in 1860, The ship of state seemed like to run around hopelessly. It was his determination and ingenuity that averted total wreck. And in his youth he saved the floatboat, so in his mature years he saved the nation. The other event was at New Orleans, where he saw with his own eyes some of the horrors of slavery. He never could tolerate a moral wrong. At a time when drinking was almost universal, he was a total abstainer. Though born in the slave trade, he had an earnest and growing repugnance to slavery. Still, up to this time he had never seen much of its workings. At this time he saw a slave market, the auctioning off of human beings. The details of this auction were so coarse and vile that it is impossible to defile these pages with an accurate and faithful description. Lincoln saw it all. He saw a beautiful mulatto girl exhibited like a racehorse. Her points dwelt on, one by one, in order, as the auctioneer said that bidders might satisfy themselves whether the article they were offering to buy was sound or not. One of his companions justly said slavery ran the iron into him then and there. His soul was stirred with righteous indignation. Turning to the others, he exclaimed with a solemn oath, "Boys, if I ever get a chance to hit that thing, I will hit it hard." He bided his time. 1/3 of a century later, he had the chance to hit that thing. He redeemed his oath. He hit it hard. Chapter 6. Desultory Employments. Upon the arrival of the Lincoln family in Illinois, they had the few tools which would have been considered almost necessary to every frontiersman, namely a common axe, a broad axe, hand saw, and whip saw. The mauls and wedges were of wood, and was made by each workman for himself. To this stock of tools may also be added a small supply of nails brought from Indiana, for at that period nails were very expensive and used with the strictest economy. By means of pegs and other devices people managed to get along without them. When Abraham Lincoln went to New Salem, it was, like all frontier towns, a promising place. It grew until it had the enormous population of about 100 people, housed or log-cabined in 15 primitive structures. The tributary county was not very important in a commercial sense. To this population no less than 4 general stores, that is, stores containing nearly everything that would be needed in that community, offered their wares. The town flourished, at least it lived, about through the period that Lincoln dwelt there, after which it disappeared. Lincoln was ready to take any work that could get him a living. A neighbor advised him to make use of his great strength in the work of a blacksmith. He seriously thought of learning the trade, but was, fortunately for the country, diverted from doing so. The success of the expedition to New Orleans had won the admiration of his employer, and he now offered Lincoln a clerkship in his prospective store. The offer was accepted, partly because it gave him some time to read, and it was here that he came to know the 2 great poets, Burns and Shakespeare. Admiration of the young clerk did him credit, but his voluble expression of it was not judicious. He bragged that Lincoln was smart enough to be president, and that he could run faster, jump higher, throw farther, and wrestle better than any man in the country. In the neighborhood there was a gang of rowdies, kind at heart but very rough, known as the Clary's Grove Boys. They took the boasting of Offutt as a direct challenge to themselves and eagerly accepted it. So they put up a giant by the name of Jack Armstrong as their champion and arranged a wrestling match. All went indifferently for a while until Lincoln seemed to be getting the better of his antagonist, while the boys crowded in and interfered while Armstrong attempted to foul. Instantly Lincoln was furious. Putting forth all his strength, he lifted Jack up and shook him as a terrier shakes a rat. The crowd, in their turn, became angry and set out to mob him. He backed up against the wall and, in hot indignation, awaited the onset. Armstrong was the first to recover his good sense, exclaiming, "Boys, Abe Lincoln is the best fellow that ever broke into the settlement." He held out his hand to Lincoln, who received it with perfect good nature. From that day these boys never lost their admiration for him. He was their hero. From that day too he became the permanent umpire, the general peacemaker of the region. His good nature, his self-command, and his manifest of fairness placed his decisions beyond question. His popularity was established once and for all in the entire community. There are some anecdotes connected with his work in the store which are worth preserving because they illustrate traits of his character. He once sold half a pound of tea to a customer. The next morning, as he was tidying up the store, he saw, by the weights which remained in the scale, that he had inadvertently given her 4 instead of 8 ounces. He instantly weighed out the balance and carried it to her, not waiting for his breakfast. At another time, when he counted up his cash at night, he discovered that he had charged a customer an excess of 6 1/4 cents. He closed up the store at once and walked to the home of the customer and returned the money. It was such things as these, in little matters as well as great, that gave him the nickname of Honest Abe, which, to his honor be it said, clung to him through life. One incident illustrates his chivalry. While he was waiting upon some woman, a ruffian came into the store using vulgar language. Lincoln asked him to desist, but he became more abusive than ever. After the woman had gone, Lincoln took him out of the store, threw him on the ground, rubbed smart weed in his face and eyes until he howled for mercy, and he gave him a lecture which did him more practical good than a volume of Chesterfield's letters. Some time after Offutt's store had winked out, while Lincoln was looking for employment, there came a chance to buy 1/2 interest in the store, the other half being owned by an idle, dissolute fellow named Berry, who ultimately drank himself into his own grave. Later, another opening came in the following way. The store of one Radford had been wrecked by the horseplay of some ruffians, and the lot was bought by Mr. Green for $400. He employed Lincoln to make an invoice of the goods, and he in turn offered Green $250 for the bargain, and the offer was accepted. But even that was not the last investment. The fourth and only remaining store in the hamlet was owned by one Rutledge. This also was bought out by the firm Berry and Lincoln. Thus they came to have the monopoly of the mercantile business in the hamlet of New Salem. Be it known that in all these transactions not a dollar in money changed hands. Men bought with promissory notes and sold for the same consideration. The mercantile venture was not successful. Berry was drinking and loafing, and Lincoln, who did not work as faithfully for himself as for another, was usually reading or telling stories. So when a couple of strangers, Trent by name, offered to buy out the store, the offer was accepted, and more promissory notes changed hands. About the time these last notes came due, the Trent brothers disappeared between 2 days. Then Berry died. The outcome of the whole series of transactions was that Lincoln was left with an assortment of promissory notes bearing the names of Herndons, Radford, Green, Rutledge, Berry, and the Trents. with one exception which will duly be narrated. His creditors told him to pay when he was able. He promised to put all his earnings, in excess of modest living expenses, into the payments of these obligations. It was the burden of many years, and he always called it the national debt, but he kept his word, paying both principal and the high rate of interest until 1848, or after 15 years, when, as a member of Congress, he paid the last cent. He was still Honest Abe. This narrative ranks the backwoodsman with Sir Walter Scott and Mark Twain, though no dinners were tendered to him, and no glowing eulogies were published from ocean to ocean. His only further experience in navigation was the piloting of the Cincinnati steamboat, the Talisman, up the Sangamon River during the high water in springtime, to show that the stream was navigable. Nothing came of it, however, and Springfield was never made the head of navigation. It was in the midst of mercantile experiences above narrated that the Black Hawk War broke out. Black Hawk was the chief of the Sac Indians, who, with some neighboring tribes, felt themselves wronged by the whites. Some of them accordingly put on the paint, raised the whoop, and entered the war pan in northern Illinois and southern Wisconsin. The governor called for soldiers, and Lincoln volunteered with the rest. The election of captain of the company was according to an original method. The two candidates were placed a short distance apart, and the men were invited to line up with one or the other according to their preference. When this was done, it was seen that Lincoln had about 3/4 of the men. This testimony to his popularity was gratifying. After he became President of the United States, he declared that no success that ever came to him gave him so much solid satisfaction. Lincoln saw almost nothing of the war. His only casualty came after its close. He had been mustered out, and his horse was stolen, so that he was compelled to walk most of the way home. After the expiration of his term of enlistment, he re-enlisted as private. As he saw no fighting, the war was to him almost literally a picnic. But in 1848, when he was in Congress, the friends of General Cass were trying to make political capital out of his alleged military services. This brought from Lincoln a speech, which showed that he had not lost the power of satire which he possessed while a lad in Indiana. "Did you know, Mr. Speaker, I am a military hero? In the days of the Black Hawk War I fought, bled, and came away. I was not at Stillman's defeat, but I was as near as it as General Cass was to Hull's surrender. And like him I saw the place very soon afterwards. It is quite certain I did not break my sword, for I had none to break, but I bent my musket pretty bad on one occasion. If General Cass went in advance of me picking whortleberries, I guess I surpassed him in the charge on the wild onions. If he saw any live fighting Indians, it was more than I did. But I had a good many bloody struggles with the mosquitoes, and although I never fainted from loss of blood, I can truly say I was often hungry. If ever I should conclude to doff whatever our democratic friends may suppose there is of black-cockade federalism about me, and thereupon they shall take me up as their candidate for the presidency, I protest that they shall not make fun of me, as they have of General Cass, by attempting to write me into a military hero. In 1833, Lincoln was appointed postmaster at New Salem. To him, the chief advantage of this position was the fact that it gave him the means of reading the papers. The principal one of these was the Louisville Journal, an exceedingly able paper, for it was in charge of George D. Prentice, one of the ablest editors this country has ever produced. The duties of the post office were few because the mail was light. The occasional letters which came were usually carried around by the postmaster in his hat. When one asked for his mail, he would gravely remove his hat and search through the package of letters. This office was discontinued in a short time, but no agent of the governor came to close up the accounts. Years later, when Lincoln was in Springfield, the officer suddenly appeared and demanded the balance due to the United States, the amount being $17.05. A friend who was by, knowing that Lincoln was short of funds, in order to save him from embarrassment, offered to lend him the needed sum. "Hold on a minute and let's see how we come out," he said. He went to his room and returned with an old rag containing money. This he counted out, being the exact sum to a cent. It was all in small denominations of silver and copper, just as it had been received. In all his emergencies of need, he had never touched the small fund which he had held in trust. To him it was sacred. He was still Honest Abe. In the early 30s, when the state of Illinois was being settled with great rapidity, the demand for surveyors was greater than the supply. John Calhoun, surveyor for the government, was in urgent need of a deputy, and Lincoln was named as a man likely to be able to fit himself for the duties on short notice. He was appointed. He borrowed the necessary book and went to work in dead earnest to learn the science. Day and night he studied until his friends, noticing the wearing effect on his health, became alarmed. But by the end of 6 weeks, an almost incredibly brief period of time, he was ready for work. It is certain that his outfit was of the simplest description, and there is a tradition that at first, instead of a surveyor's chain, he used a long, straight, wild grapevine. Those who understand the conditions and requirements of surveying in early days say that this is not improbable. A more important fact is that Lincoln surveys have never been called in question, which is something that can be said of very few frontier surveyors. Though he learned the science in so short a time, yet here, as always, he was thorough. At this point may be mentioned an occurrence which took place a year or two later. It was his first romance of love, his engagement to a beautiful girl, Anne Rutledge, and his bereavement. Her untimely death nearly unsettled his mind. He was afflicted with melancholy to such a degree that his friends dared not leave him alone. For years afterwards the thought of her would shake his whole frame with emotion, and he would sit with his face buried in his hands while tears trickled through. A friend once begged him to forget his sorrow. "I cannot," he said. "The thought of rain and snow on her grave fills me with indescribable grief." Somehow, we know not how, the poem, "Oh, why should the spirit of mortal be proud?" was in his mind connected with Anne Rutledge. Possibly it might have been a favorite with her. There was certainly some association, and through his whole life he was fond of it and often repeated it. Nor did he forget her. It was late in his life that he said, "I really and truly loved the girl and think often of her now." Then, after a pause, "And I have loved the name Rutledge to this day." This bereavement took much from Lincoln. Did it give him nothing? Patience, earnestness, tenderness, sympathy. These are sometimes the gifts which are sent by the messenger sorrow. We are justified in believing that this sad event was one of the means of ripening the character of this great man, and that to it was due a measure of his usefulness in his mature years. End of Chapter 6. Join us next time for Chapters 7, 8, and 9.